I woke up with deep, blue bruises on my throat, marks from fingers that were too long to be human. My landlady just smiled, placing a fresh plate of meat for her dead husband and whispering, "He's been hungry for so long." Last night, I heard him eating. Tonight, I realized I'm not just a guest. I'm the main course. Elias Thorne arrived in the town of Blackwood Falls on August 30th, just as the sky over New England began to thicken with clouds the color of tarnished silver and wet lead. The air was heavy with the scent of impending rain and the bitter tang of dying leaves, a premature autumn that seemed to have claimed the valley before its time. As he stepped off the bus, the silence of the town pressed against his ears like a physical weight, broken only by the rhythmic thud of his suitcase against his knee. Each step on the cracked, uneven pavement sent a hollow, lonely sound echoing through the empty street, a dull percussion that announced his arrival to the rows of shuttered houses. The Gable residence stood apart from its neighbors, a towering Victorian structure shielded by a dense thicket of leaning fir trees. Their branches were gnarled and overgrown, interlacing like the fingers of a skeleton, and as the wind sighed through them, they produced a long, mournful groan. The sound was thin and wavering, a collective lament that followed Elias as he walked up the weed-choked path. The house itself was a study in neglect, its gray wooden siding peeling away in long strips that fluttered like dead skin in the breeze. When the heavy oak door finally groaned open, Elias was met by a wave of air that felt decades old, a stagnant mixture of dried lavender, yellowed paper, and a faint, cloying sweetness. Beneath the scent of cleanliness lay something sharper, a trace of organic rot hidden deep within the floorboards or perhaps behind the floral wallpaper. Adeline Gable stood in the dim light of the foyer, her frame so thin and brittle she seemed to be composed of nothing but glass and ancient silk. Her face was a delicate map of intersecting lines, resembling the fine, spiderweb cracks found on a piece of antique porcelain that had been dropped and painstakingly glued back together. Her greeting was not a voice so much as a dry, sibilant whisper that mimicked the sound of dry leaves skittering across a tombstone. She moved with a strange, gliding grace, gesturing for him to follow her into the bowels of the house. As they ascended the central staircase, the wood beneath the threadbare carpet screamed under Elias's weight, a sharp, splintering noise that sounded like the crushing of dry bones. The hallway upstairs was a tunnel of shadows, where the dim light of the afternoon failed to reach the corners, leaving the ceiling to vanish into a velvet, oppressive blackness. The room she provided was small and cramped, dominated by a high-backed bed with an iron frame that cast jagged, spider-like shadows against the plaster walls. A single window overlooked the encroaching forest, but the glass was so distorted and clouded with grime that the trees outside appeared as writhing, distorted limbs. Elias set his suitcase down, the sound swallowed instantly by the heavy velvet drapes that smelled of dust and funeral incense. He felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees, a sudden chill that raised the hair on his arms and turned his breath into a faint, vanishing mist. By the time evening descended, the house had transitioned into a state of absolute, suffocating stillness. Elias made his way down to the dining room, where the light of a single, flickering chandelier struggled to illuminate the massive oak table at the center of the room. The wood was dark and polished to a mirror-like sheen, reflecting the two place settings that had been laid out with mathematical precision. One plate sat at the foot of the table for him, while the second remained at the head, positioned before a towering, empty chair that seemed to loom over the room like a silent judge. Mrs. Gable moved with silent efficiency, her pale hands trembling slightly as she spooned a portion of thick, red braised beef and pale potatoes onto the second plate. She smoothed the linen napkin beside the empty setting with a lingering, tender touch, her lips moving in a silent conversation that Elias could not hear. Finally, she leaned toward the empty chair and murmured that Arthur had always been quite punctual for his evening meal, her voice a soft, velvet caress. Elias forced a rigid, uncomfortable smile, his muscles tensing as he tried to convince himself that he was merely witnessing the harmless ritual of a grieving widow. The meal began in a silence so thick it felt as though the air had turned to liquid. The only sound in the room was the rhythmic, metallic scrape of Mrs. Gable's fork against her plate, a harsh and grating noise that set Elias's teeth on edge. He kept his eyes lowered, focusing on the steam rising from his own food, but he could not shake the sensation of being watched from the head of the table. A cold draft swirled around his ankles, and the candlelight flickered violently, casting a long, elongated shadow from the empty chair that stretched across the floor until it touched his own feet. As Elias reached for his glass, his hand froze in midair. A new sound joined the symphony of the old house, a slow, deliberate screech of silver against ceramic coming from the opposite end of the table. He looked up, his heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against his ribs, and saw a deep groove being carved into the meat on the second plate. The fork at the empty setting moved with a jerk, dragging across the porcelain with a sound that vibrated through the table and into Elias's very marrow. Mrs. Gable did not look up, her own eating continuing with a serene, terrifying normalcy while the food on the dead man's plate began to disappear, piece by piece, into the hungry, invisible air. The first week in Blackwood Falls dissolved into a gray, featureless blur, as if the town and the house had conspired to leach the color from Elias Thorne's very existence. Each morning began with a sky the color of a bruised plum, shifting slowly into a dull, chalky white that never quite allowed the sun to break through the thick canopy of fir trees. The house itself seemed to breathe in rhythm with the fog, its ancient timber expanding and contracting with a series of groans that sounded uncomfortably like a gargantuan beast settling into a deep, uneasy slumber. Elias found himself moving through the hallways with an involuntary stealth, his footsteps light and hesitant, as if any sudden vibration might rouse something that was better left undisturbed beneath the floorboards. The passage of time was marked not by the sun, but by the rigid, liturgical sequence of Mrs. Gable's domestic habits, which functioned with the terrifying precision of a clockwork mechanism. Every evening, as the shadows in the corners of the house began to stretch and bleed into one another, the silence would be shattered by a specific, haunting melody of domesticity. From the kitchen below, the sound of heavy ceramic sliding across the scarred surface of the oak table would rise through the floorboards, a rhythmic, abrasive scrape that set Elias's teeth on edge. Slide. Click. Slide. Click. It was the sound of a woman laying a table for two, a performance executed with such unwavering consistency that it felt less like a chore and more like a desperate, silent prayer intended to keep the walls from collapsing. When the grandfather clock in the foyer struck 7 o'clock, the vibrations of the heavy brass bell seemed to ripple through the very air Elias breathed, signaling the start of the evening meal. He would descend the stairs, his hand gripping the cold, polished banister until his knuckles turned as white as the bone china waiting for him below. The dining room was always bathed in a sickly, amber glow from the flickering chandelier, which cast long, dancing shadows that looked like skeletal fingers reaching toward the centerpiece. At the far end of the table, the place setting for Arthur remained a constant, suffocating presence, the silver cutlery gleaming with a cold, predatory light under the dim bulbs. As Elias sat across from the empty chair, he felt a localized drop in temperature, a pocket of stagnant, freezing air that seemed to radiate from the head of the table where no one sat. He focused his entire attention on the texture of his food, the way the steam rose in thin, twisting ribbons before vanishing into the darkness of the ceiling, but his peripheral vision betrayed him at every turn. It began as a subtle shimmering, a visual distortion like the heat haze rising from sun-scorched asphalt, hovering just inches above the seat of Arthur's chair. If he dared to look directly, there was nothing but the velvet upholstery and the oppressive silence, yet the moment his gaze drifted, the air seemed to thicken and take on a heavy, semi-solid quality that defied the laws of physics. Mrs. Gable presided over these dinners with a terrifying, serene grace, her movements fluid and practiced as she tended to the needs of her invisible companion. She would lean forward, the fine lace of her sleeve brushing against the edge of the empty plate, and whisper words that were nothing more than a soft, sibilant hiss in the quiet room. Her eyes, clouded with the milky film of age, never once wavered from the space where a man's face should have been, reflecting an absolute, unwavering certainty that made Elias's blood run cold. He watched as she carefully cut the meat on the second plate into small, manageable pieces, the serrated edge of the knife producing a high-pitched, screeching sound as it grated against the expensive porcelain. The nights were the worst, for the house never truly slept, it merely shifted its focus from the visible to the auditory, becoming a vast, hollow instrument played by the wind and the shadows. Elias would lie in his bed, the sheets pulled tight against his chin, listening to the architectural anatomy of the building as it creaked and settled in the darkness. Somewhere deep in the guts of the house, perhaps in the flooded crawl spaces of the basement, a pipe was leaking, releasing a steady, rhythmic drip that echoed through the vents with a heavy, metallic resonance. Plink. 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 The sound was so deliberate, so measured, that it began to sync with the frantic thrumming of his own pulse, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to be counting down to an inevitable, unseen event. On the night of the 7th day, the air in the bedroom became exceptionally thick, smelling of wet earth and the sharp, metallic tang of an approaching storm. Elias drifted into a shallow, feverish sleep, haunted by dreams of long, pale fingers weaving through the roots of trees, only to be jolted awake by a sound that did not belong to the wind or the shifting timber. It was coming from directly beneath him, from the dining room, a sound so visceral and wet that it made his stomach turn in a slow, agonizing knot. It was the sound of someone eating, a rhythmic, moist smacking of lips and the heavy, labored breathing of a creature consuming something with a desperate, animalistic hunger. He remained paralyzed in the darkness, his eyes wide and fixed on the ceiling, while his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Each sound from below was amplified by the silence of the room, the wet slide of a tongue against a spoon, the heavy thud of a glass being set down on wood, and then, most terrifying of all, a sharp, ringing click of steel against the rim of a plate. It was the sound of a knife being wrested after a meal, a final, definitive gesture that signaled the end of the feast. Elias held his breath until his lungs burned, listening as the silence returned, heavier and more suffocating than before, leaving him alone with the frantic ticking of the small clock on his nightstand. The clock marked the passage of the hours with a dry, mechanical chatter, tick, 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 that seemed to mock his terror in the absolute stillness of the early morning. He watched the shadows on the wall shift as the moon moved behind the clouds, imagining he could see the silhouette of a man standing in the corner, his form composed of nothing but the absence of light. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the echo of that wet, slurping sound, a memory that felt like a physical stain on his mind, making him feel as though the very air in the room had become tainted by something ancient and predatory. He did not sleep again, instead staring at the door until the first faint, sickly rays of dawn began to bleed through the grime on the windowpane. When the light finally became strong enough to cast a pale, gray illumination over the hallway, Elias forced himself out of bed, his limbs heavy and stiff as if they had been turned to lead. He moved toward the stairs, his bare feet recoiling from the icy touch of the wooden floorboards, which seemed to hum with a faint, low-frequency vibration. The house was deathly quiet, the usual morning sounds of Mrs. Gable moving in the kitchen replaced by an eerie, expectant vacuum. As he reached the landing, he noticed that the air grew colder with every step he took toward the ground floor, a subterranean chill that smelled of stagnant water and old, forgotten things. He crept into the dining room, his breath hitching in his throat as he approached the massive oak table that sat like an altar in the center of the space. The room was empty of life, the curtains drawn tight against the morning, yet the table was not as he had left it the night before. His own place setting was untouched, the napkin still folded in its stiff, upright triangle, but the head of the table told a different story. The second plate, which Mrs. Gable had filled with such care before they retired, was no longer pristine. It sat in the center of the table, a stark, accusing evidence of a guest who had not been invited by the living. Elias leaned closer, his eyes stinging in the dim light as he examined the surface of the porcelain, his hand trembling so violently he had to grip the back of a nearby chair for support. The plate was covered in a thick, translucent film of congealed fat, a yellowed grease that had begun to harden into a waxy substance in the morning cold. In the very center of the plate lay a single, white bone, stripped so clean of meat and sinew that it looked as though it had been bleached by the sun for 100 years. There were deep, jagged grooves in the surface of the bone, marks that looked suspiciously like the indentations of human teeth, pressed deep into the calcium with a force that should have been impossible. The realization that Mrs. Gable was still upstairs, her bedroom door shut and silent, sent a wave of nausea rolling through him that left him gasping for air. There was no rational explanation for the empty plate, no logic that could account for the grease and the bone in a house where only two people lived, one of whom was still asleep. He looked at the heavy, high-backed chair, and for a fleeting, terrifying second, he thought he saw the velvet fabric of the seat compress, as if a great weight had just been removed from it. The air in the room seemed to sigh, a soft, exhaling sound that carried the faint, unmistakable scent of a man's heavy wool coat and the bitter smoke of a guttering candle. Elias backed away from the table, his heart leaping into his throat as his heel caught on the edge of the rug, nearly sending him sprawling onto the cold floor. He turned and fled toward the kitchen, desperate for the mundane sounds of a whistling kettle or the smell of brewing coffee to ground him in reality, but the silence followed him like a shadow. As he stood in the doorway of the darkened kitchen, he realized that the rhythmic drip from the basement had stopped, replaced by a new sound that was much, much worse. It was a soft, wet sliding sound coming from the stairs behind him, the sound of something heavy and uncoordinated dragging itself upward, one agonizing step at a time, toward the room where he had tried to sleep. The 10th morning arrived with a silence so absolute it felt like a physical pressure against the eardrums, a thick and suffocating blanket of stillness that seemed to have swallowed the very soul of Blackwood Falls. Elias Thorne lay motionless beneath the heavy, moth-eaten quilts of his bed, his eyes fixed on the ceiling where the gray light of dawn revealed a network of cracks that resembled the dry, frantic veins of a dying leaf. As he attempted to draw a breath, he was met with a localized, leaden heaviness centered squarely upon his throat, a crushing sensation that made every swallow a calculated, agonizing effort. It was not the tightness of a coming illness, but a distinct, external weight, as if a pair of massive, unseen stones had been placed atop his windpipe while he drifted in the shallow waters of sleep. The air in the room was unnaturally cold, carrying the sharp, biting scent of frost-nipped earth and the persistent, underlying stench of old, dampened wood that seemed to exhale from the very pores of the wallpaper. He forced himself to sit up, his movements sluggish and uncoordinated, while the bedsprings beneath him emitted a high-pitched, metallic shriek that echoed far too loudly in the hollow chamber. His hands, trembling with a sudden, uncontrollable palsy, reached up to touch the skin of his neck, expecting to find the inflamed tenderness of a swollen gland or the heat of an infection. Instead, his fingertips met a surface that was unnaturally smooth and frigid, a band of flesh that possessed the waxy, unresponsive texture of a candle. There was no pain, only a terrifying absence of sensation, as if the nerves beneath the skin had been cauterized by a sudden application of dry ice. He could feel the pressure of his own fingers against the deeper tissues, but the surface of his throat remained a numb, foreign landscape, a dead zone of tactile silence that sent a primary jolt of adrenaline through his sluggish veins. Stumbling toward the small, cramped bathroom at the end of the hallway, Elias gripped the doorframe for support, his nails digging into the soft, rotting timber until the wood groaned in protest. The bathroom was a narrow, claustrophobic space, illuminated only by a single, flickering bulb that hummed with a low, electrical thrum, casting a sickly yellow pallor over the rusted fixtures. He leaned over the pedestal sink, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches that fogged the surface of the medicine cabinet's mirror. The glass was severely tarnished and bisected by a jagged, lightning bolt crack that ran from the upper corner to the bottom, distorting his reflection into a fractured, unrecognizable mess of pale skin and wide, shadowed eyes. He reached out with a damp cloth, wiping away the condensation in a single, frantic stroke to reveal the truth of what had transpired in the dark. The sight that met his gaze caused him to recoil so violently that his back struck the opposite wall with a dull, sickening thud. Etched into the porcelain-white skin of his throat were a series of deep, livid contusions, a collection of that contrasted sharply against the surrounding pallor like ink spilled on snow. These were not the random marks of a restless night or the irritations of a rough collar, they were the unmistakable imprints of a human hand, or something that mimicked the form of one with horrifying accuracy. The bruises were composed of 4 long, unnaturally thin finger marks on the left side and a broad, crushing thumbprint on the right, forming a perfect, strangling collar that completely encircled his neck. The phalanges were impossibly elongated, the indentations of the knuckles pressed so deep into his flesh that they appeared as dark, indigo pits of stilled blood. He leaned back in, his heart drumming a frantic, syncopated rhythm against his ribs as he traced the outline of the marks with a shaking finger. The deep crimson of the central bruises bled out into a sickly, necrotic blue at the edges, suggesting a grip that had been held with a steady, relentless force for hours on end. It looked as though someone had stood directly behind him throughout the night, their hands locked around his throat not to kill, but to anchor him, to keep him perfectly still while the house went about its secret business. As his skin made contact with the bruises, a sudden, piercing wave of ice water cold surged from the marks, radiating upward into his jaw and downward into his chest, a frost that seemed to crystallize the very marrow of his bones. He gasped, a dry, wheezing sound, as the numbness spread, leaving him with the sensation that his head was no longer entirely connected to his body. The instinct to survive, to rationalize the irrational, flared up within him like a dying ember, and he began to mutter silent, desperate excuses to the fractured reflection in the mirror. He told himself that the marks were merely the result of a strange, nocturnal seizure, or perhaps a violent reaction to the ancient, microscopic spores that drifted in the stagnant air of the Gable house. He tried to convince his racing mind that he had simply slept with his arm tucked awkwardly beneath his chin, the weight of his own limb creating the illusion of a hand. Yet, as he turned his head, he saw the way the bruises followed the exact anatomy of a chokehold, the ghostly pressure still lingering like a phantom limb, mocking his attempts to find a logical sanctuary. The smell of the room changed then, shifting from the scent of old paper to the heavy, iron-rich aroma of fresh blood and the bitter, alkaline scent of fear. Descending the stairs was a feat of sheer, agonizing will, as each step seemed to vibrate with a sinister energy that traveled up through the soles of his feet. The house felt more crowded than usual, the air thick and viscous as if he were wading through a pool of invisible syrup that clung to his clothes and slowed his every movement. The rhythmic creaking of the floorboards under his weight sounded less like structural settling and more like a chorus of low, appreciative whispers following his progress toward the dining room. As he reached the bottom landing, he caught the faint, unmistakable sound of a heavy object being dragged across the floor in the kitchen, a wet, sliding noise that stopped the very moment his foot touched the final step. The dining room was bathed in the gray, dismal light of the overcast morning, the heavy drapes drawn back just enough to reveal the swirling mist that pressed against the windowpanes like a living shroud. Mrs. Gable was already seated at the table, her back perfectly straight, her hands folded neatly over a tattered lace tablecloth that appeared to have been stained with something dark and indelible. She did not look up as he entered, her attention seemingly fixed on a small, porcelain teacup that sat before her, its surface perfectly still and black as oil. The smell of the room was overwhelming, a cloying mixture of overripe fruit, stale grease, and the sharp, medicinal scent of the liniment the old woman used on her joints. As Elias took his seat, the wood of the chair felt unnaturally warm beneath him, as if someone had just vacated it a second before his arrival. He kept his chin tucked low, the collar of his shirt pulled up in a desperate attempt to conceal the horrific marks on his neck, but his efforts were futile. Mrs. Gable slowly turned her head toward him, her movements possessing the jerky, unnatural precision of a mechanical doll, until her gaze locked onto his. Her eyes were almost entirely obscured by a thick, milky veil of cataracts, appearing like two clouded marbles set into a face of cracked parchment. She did not speak, but a slow, knowing smile spread across her thin lips, revealing gums that were a pale, unhealthy gray. The smile was not one of kindness or even of recognition, but a gesture of terrible, intimate complicity that made Elias's skin crawl with 1,000 invisible insects. Her clouded eyes did not focus on his face, but drifted slightly upward and to the left, fixating on the empty air directly behind his shoulder with a look of profound, reverent devotion. She nodded once, a tiny, subtle movement, as if acknowledging a silent command from a third party that Elias could neither see nor hear. The temperature in the room plummeted, the air becoming so cold that the steam from the tea began to swirl in frantic, chaotic patterns, and Elias felt a sudden, sharp prickling at the nape of his neck, as if the fine hairs were being brushed by a phantom breath. The silence was broken by the sound of a metal spoon clinking against the side of a bowl, but the sound did not come from Mrs. Gable's side of the table. It originated from the head of the table, where the empty chair of Arthur Gable sat in the shadows, its high velvet back casting a long, distorted silhouette across the floor. Elias froze, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard that his knuckles turned a ghostly white, his eyes darting toward the empty place setting. The silver spoon, which had been resting neatly on the linen napkin, was now vibrating with a high-pitched, crystalline ring, its handle twitching as if an invisible hand were attempting to find a comfortable grip. Then came the sound that finally shattered the last of Elias's fragile composure, a low, rhythmic scraping of ceramic against wood, identical to the sound he had heard every night of the past week. But this time, it was accompanied by a new, visceral detail that made the blood turn to slush in his veins. From the depths of the empty chair, a sound emerged that defied the vacuum of the room, a heavy, intermittent, and wetly whistling breath. It was the sound of a man struggling for air through a throat filled with fluid, a jagged, raspy inhalation followed by a long, sibilant hiss that sounded like steam escaping a ruptured pipe. The breath was close, so close that Elias could feel the rhythmic pulse of it against his left ear, carrying with it the undeniable, nauseating stench of the grave. The whistling grew louder, more frantic, the sound of a pair of collapsed lungs being forced to expand by an external, malevolent will. Each breath was punctuated by a soft, gurgling click deep within the invisible throat, a sound of wet tissue sliding against bone that made Elias want to scream, though his own throat felt as though it had been fused shut with lead. He watched, paralyzed by a primal, soul-deep terror, as a small, dark stain began to materialize on the pristine white tablecloth directly in front of the empty chair. It was a drop of thick, viscous fluid that looked like diluted bile, spreading slowly into the fabric, followed by another, and then another, as if something invisible were leaning over the table, dripping with the foul liquids of decay. Mrs. Gable's smile widened, her cataracts gleaming with a frantic, inner light as she watched the stain spread, her hands beginning to tremble with a grotesque, ecstatic joy. She leaned forward, her voice a mere shadow of a whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves, murmuring that Arthur was always so hungry after a long night of work. The whistling breath behind Elias's ear intensified, turning into a low, guttering growl that vibrated through the very chair he sat in, and he felt the unmistakable sensation of long, frigid fingers beginning to brush against the bruises on his neck. The marks on his throat began to throb with a dull, rhythmic ache that matched the timing of the invisible man's labored breathing, a horrifying synchronization that signaled he was no longer just a guest in the house, but a part of its grim, eternal machinery. By the time the 14th day arrived, the paranoia had begun to dissolve the boundaries of Elias Thorne's mind like a slow-acting acid, eating through the lacquer of his reason until only the raw, jagged nerves remained. Sleep had become a distant, treacherous memory, a luxury he could no longer afford in a house that seemed to wait for the closing of his eyelids to rearrange its geometry. His reflection in the modeled bathroom mirror had transformed into a hollow-eyed stranger, whose skin possessed a translucent, waxy quality and whose hands never truly stopped their minute, frantic vibrating. The world outside the Gable house had ceased to exist, replaced by a claustrophobic reality where every shadow was a predatory weight and every silence was merely a gathering of breath before a scream. He found himself staring at the walls for hours, watching the way the floral patterns on the wallpaper seemed to writhe and interlace like a mass of slow-moving, geometric worms in the guttering candlelight. The physical sanctuary of his bedroom felt increasingly like a fragile wooden crate suspended over a dark and bottomless abyss. In a desperate, feverish burst of energy, Elias had dragged the massive, iron-bound oak dresser across the room, the feet of the heavy furniture carving deep, permanent scars into the floorboards with a screech that sounded like a dying animal. He jammed the edge of the dresser against the bedroom door, feeling the solid resistance of the wood and the reassuring weight of the object as it blocked the only entrance. Yet, as he sat on the edge of his bed, gasping for air that felt thick with the taste of copper and dust, the barrier felt ridiculously inadequate, appearing as thin and porous as wet parchment against the pressure of what lay beyond. The heavy timber of the house groaned in response to his efforts, a deep, subterranean vibration that traveled up through his feet and settled in the very center of his chest. The darkness of the evening was absolute, a thick and oily substance that seemed to seep in through the cracks in the window frame and the gaps beneath the door. Elias sat huddled on the center of the mattress, his back curved and his muscles coiled with a tension that made his joints ache with a dull, rhythmic throb. In his right hand, he gripped the handle of a stolen kitchen knife, the cold steel biting into his palm as a constant, biting reminder of his own mortality. The blade caught the faint, sickly light of the moon, casting a sharp, silvery reflection against the opposite wall that danced and shuddered with every frantic beat of his heart. He did not blink, his eyes straining until they burned, fixed on the narrow sliver of space where the door met the frame, waiting for the first sign of an intrusion. The transition from the mundane creaks of the settling house to the arrival of the visitor was marked by a sudden, unnatural stillness that felt as though the air itself had frozen into a solid block of ice. Then, from the far end of the hallway, beyond the stairs, came the first sound, a heavy, rhythmic percussion that made the floorboards beneath the dresser shudder. It was not the sound of a human step, but a visceral, wet thud followed by a long, sliding drag, as if a massive, saturated weight were being hauled across the carpet. Slop. Creak. Slop. The sound was accompanied by the muffled, rhythmic squelch of something liquid being compressed, evoking the image of a heavy, sodden sack of meat being dragged through a mire of its own making. It moved with a terrifying, deliberate slowness, each step punctuated by a pause that allowed the sound to echo through the hollow lungs of the house. As the wet footsteps drew closer, a new sensory assault reached Elias, penetrating the gaps around the barricade and filling the room with the suffocating atmosphere of a long-forgotten tomb. It began as a faint, metallic tang, but rapidly thickened into the overwhelming stench of ancient, anaerobic rot and the cloying, sweet perfume of stagnant water. It was the smell of deep, wet earth where the sun never reached, of black mold blooming on the underside of a coffin lid, and of something organic that had been left to liquefy in the dark. Elias pressed the back of his hand against his mouth, his stomach heaving in a violent, silent spasm, while the invisible cloud of decay settled over him like a damp, heavy shroud. The scent seemed to have a physical weight, pressing against his skin and filling his throat with the taste of gray, crumbling bone. The dragging sound stopped directly outside his door, the sudden cessation of noise more terrifying than the movement itself. Elias could sense the immense, unseen pressure against the other side of the wood, a cold and lightless vacuum that seemed to suck the warmth out of the room. The dresser, which had seemed so substantial moments before, now appeared to tremble as if caught in a localized earthquake, its dark wood groaning under the strain of an external force. He held his breath, his lungs burning with the need for oxygen, listening to the absolute silence of the hallway. Then, a sound emerged from the darkness of the keyhole, a thin, high-pitched whistling, like the sound of a gale force wind being squeezed through a needle's eye. It was the sound of air being violently sucked inward, a sharp, sibilant inhalation that suggested something on the other side was tasting the air of his room, drawing the scent of his fear deep into its unseen anatomy. The silence returned for a heartbeat, and then came the scratching, a dry, rhythmic sound of something hard and pointed working against the exterior of the door. It was not the frantic clawing of an animal, but a calculated, investigative scraping, as if a set of long, chitinous nails were searching for a weakness in the grain of the oak. The sound was high and crystalline, like a diamond being dragged across glass, and it moved in slow, agonizing circles around the perimeter of the doorframe. Elias could see the wood beginning to splinter and flake under the pressure, tiny shards of timber falling onto the carpet in the hallway, though he saw no tool and no hand. The scratching sound seemed to vibrate within his own skull, a grating, rhythmic intrusion that mimicked the sound of a moth's wings beating against a paper screen. Paralyzed by a primal, soul-deep terror, Elias retreated to the furthest corner of the bed, pulling his knees to his chest and burying his face in the crook of his arm. He squeezed his eyes shut until he saw bursts of fractured, geometric light, but his ears remained cruelly open to the symphony of the nightmare. He could hear his own pulse thundering in his ears, a frantic, uneven rhythm that seemed to be counting down the seconds until the barrier failed. The knife in his hand felt like a toy, a useless sliver of metal against a force that could travel through the very fabric of the house. He began to rock back and forth, a minute, rhythmic movement that was his only defense against the total disintegration of his mind, while the scratching outside the door grew louder, more insistent, turning into a sound of deep, wet gouging. Even with his eyelids pressed tightly together, Elias became aware of a change in the light, a shifting of the shadows that indicated something was entering the room despite the barricade. A cold, damp vapor began to curl around his ankles, a mist that felt like the touch of 1,000 tiny, freezing needles. He forced his eyes open just enough to see a thick, yellow-gray fog billowing through the narrow gap beneath the door, moving with a fluid, predatory grace that defied the stagnant air of the room. The fog was not gaseous but possessed a viscous, oily consistency, clinging to the floor and the legs of the dresser like a living, translucent slime. It carried with it the intensified scent of the grave, a concentrated essence of earth and putrefaction that made the air in the room nearly impossible to breathe. As Elias watched, frozen in a state of catatonic dread, the rolling clouds of mist began to coalesce and thicken, taking on a horrifying, semi-solid form in the center of the floor. The vapor swirled and knitted itself together, forming the unmistakable outlines of two immense. The limbs were unnaturally long, the skin appearing as a translucent, mottled gray that revealed the dark, pulsing veins and the jagged white of the bone beneath. The fingers were impossibly thin, consisting of too many joints that clicked and popped with a wet, sickening sound as they flexed against the carpet. These spectral hands did not reach for the dresser or the door, they simply lay there on the floor, the long, black-tipped nails digging into the fabric of the rug, as if the rest of the creature were still standing in the hallway, waiting for the door to simply cease to be an obstacle. The hands began to move, crawling across the floor with the slow, jerky gait of a pair of gargantuan, pale spiders. They moved toward the bed, the fingers leaving long, damp trails on the wood where the carpet ended, the sound of their movement a soft, rhythmic patter that sounded like rain on a tin roof. Elias felt the temperature in the corner of the room drop until his breath came out in thick, white clouds, the frost beginning to bloom in delicate, fern-like patterns on the blade of his knife. The hands reached the edge of the mattress, the long, knotty fingers curling over the side and pulling the heavy fabric of the quilts downward with a strength that was both effortless and absolute. He realized then that the dresser, the locks, and the knife were all illusions of safety in a world where the dead were no longer content to remain in their plates, and the hopeless, hollow realization of his own impending consumption filled him with a cold, final silence. The 20th of September arrived with a sky that appeared to have been bruised, a deep and sickly purple bleeding into a horizon of burnt orange as the sun began its slow, terminal descent behind the jagged silhouettes of the Blackwood Falls pines. Elias Thorne stood in the center of his room, the air around him vibrating with a tension so thick it felt like wading through a stagnant pool of black water. He did not reach for his suitcase, for the very idea of lingering long enough to fold a shirt felt like an invitation to a burial. Instead, he snatched his heavy wool coat from the bedpost, the fabric rough and damp against his trembling fingers. His movements were frantic, driven by a primal, lizard-brain impulse to flee before the last slivers of daylight vanished and the house's true master claimed the night. He burst into the hallway, his boots thumping against the floorboards with a desperate, hollow rhythm that echoed through the skeletal frame of the building, sounding like the rapid, uneven heartbeat of a dying animal. As he reached the top of the grand staircase, the air from the foyer rose to meet him, carrying the scent of ancient dust and a sharp, metallic undertone that tasted of old copper coins and dried blood. He took the steps two at a time, his hand skidding along the cold, greasy surface of the banister, while the wood beneath him groaned in a long, descending wail that seemed to vibrate within his very marrow. The shadows in the corners of the landing were lengthening, stretching out like the limbs of a predatory insect, reaching for the hem of his coat as he plummeted toward the ground floor. Every instinct screamed at him to keep moving, to not look back at the dark mouth of the upper hallway, which now seemed to exhale a breath of freezing, subterranean air. He reached the heavy oak front door and threw his entire weight against it, expecting the simple resistance of a latch, but the door remained as immovable as a slab of granite. His eyes widened as he saw the transformation of the entryway. Where there had once been a single, simple lock, there were now dozens of heavy, iron-bound bolts and brass latches, arranged in a chaotic, overlapping pattern that covered the wood from the threshold to the lintel. The metal was dark and pitted, looking as though it had aged a century in the span of a single afternoon, and as Elias clawed at the first bolt, the iron felt unnaturally hot, searing his fingertips with a dry, pulsing heat. He fumbled with the sliding mechanisms, but they were seized with rust or held by some invisible, crushing force, their metallic shrieks mocking his frantic efforts to create an exit. The rhythmic sound of a rocking chair began to filter through the foyer, a slow and deliberate creak groan that cut through the silence of the house with surgical precision. Elias turned slowly, his breath hitching in his chest, to find Adeline Gable sitting in the shadows of the parlor, her silhouette illuminated only by the dying, amber light filtering through the high windows. Her knitting needles moved with a hypnotic, mechanical speed, clicking together with a sharp, crystalline sound, click-clack, that felt like a needle being driven into the base of his skull. She did not look up from her work, her head bowed in a posture of serene, grandmotherly devotion, but the shadow she cast against the wall was distorted, appearing as a towering, many-limbed entity that swayed in time with the chair. Her voice emerged from the gloom not as speech, but as a dry, sibilant vibration of the air, a sound like dead leaves being ground into the soil of a fresh grave. Without turning her clouded, milky gaze toward him, she let the sound drift through the room, a series of raspy, rhythmic huffs that conveyed a terrifying message of hospitality. She spoke of Arthur's deep and abiding affection for their new guest, her words carrying the heavy weight of a final sentence, noting how long her husband had endured the gnawing pangs of a hollow, lightless hunger. The sound of her knitting needles intensified, the click-clack becoming a rapid-fire staccato that seemed to sync with the frantic, uneven thudding of Elias's pulse. Driven by a sudden, white-hot burst of panic, Elias abandoned the door and lunged toward the tall, narrow window beside the parlor entrance, his boots sliding on the polished floorboards. He grabbed a heavy, ladder-back chair and swung it with all the strength of his terror, aiming for the center of the clouded glass pane. But instead of the sharp, shattering explosion of glass, the impact produced a dull, heavy thud, as if he had struck a thick layer of damp wool or a slab of unyielding meat. The window did not crack, it merely rippled like the surface of a black pond, the glass appearing thick and viscous, more akin to a layer of ancient, murky ice than anything manufactured by men. The vibration of the blow traveled up the chair and into his arms, a numbing, deadening shock that left his muscles weak and his fingers tingling with a pins and needles sensation. The air in the room suddenly curdled, the temperature plummeting with such violent speed that Elias could see his own breath erupting in thick, roiling plumes of white vapor. The silence that followed his failed escape was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the sound of the wind and the trees from the world outside, leaving only the internal noises of his own body. Then, from the darkness of the dining room directly behind him, came a sound that froze the very fluid in his joints, a low, wet, "an." It was a sound of fluid-filled lungs struggling to expand, a ragged inhalation that carried the unmistakable gurgle of decay, transitioning into a deep, resonant rumble of satisfaction. It was the sound of a predator that had finally cornered its prey, a satisfied, guttural purr that vibrated through the floorboards and up into the soles of Elias's feet. He turned with the slow, agonizing precision of a man watching his own execution, his eyes fixed on the massive oak table that sat in the center of the neighboring room. The single candle on the table had flickered out, but the fading light from the windows was enough to illuminate the second plate, the one reserved for Arthur. As Elias watched, the heavy ceramic dish began to lift from the tablecloth, rising into the air with a smooth, effortless grace as if held by a steady, invisible hand. It hovered for a moment at the level of a man's chest, the white porcelain gleaming with a pale, ghostly luminescence in the gathering gloom, and then the air around the plate began to distort, shimmering like a heat haze over a summer road. A sharp, explosive crack echoed through the room, the sound of stone being ground against stone, as a section of the floating plate vanished into thin air. There was no visible mouth, no teeth of ivory or bone, only the sudden, violent disintegration of the porcelain as it was crushed by an unseen, tremendous pressure. The sound of the grinding was rhythmic and wet, crunch, snap, grind, accompanied by a low, contented humming that seemed to emanate from the very space where the plate was being consumed. Fine white dust, the pulverized remains of the ceramic, began to drift downward like a light, funerary snow, coating the dark wood of the table and the edges of the empty chair in a thin, pale shroud. Elias watched in a state of catatonic horror as the invisible entity continued its feast, the plate disappearing bit by bit until only a small, jagged shard remained suspended in the air. The sound of the chewing was visceral and moist, a rhythmic gnashing that suggested a jaw of immense power and a hunger that porcelain could never truly satisfy. As the last fragment of the plate was crushed into a fine powder, the floating dust began to swirl in the air, caught in the draft of an unseen, exhaling breath that carried the suffocating stench of wet earth and ancient, moldering wool. The empty chair at the head of the table creaked as if a great weight were settling back into its velvet cushions, and the low, guttural rattling sound began again, closer now, shifting from the table toward the spot where Elias stood paralyzed in the freezing dark. The night had finally achieved a state of absolute, ink-black perfection, a darkness so dense and heavy that it seemed to possess a physical weight, pressing down upon the Gable house until the very foundations groaned in submission. Elias Thorne lay supine upon the narrow mattress of his bed, his body rendered into a statue of frozen meat and brittle bone, incapable of twitching even the smallest muscle in his extremities. His eyes were locked wide, the pupils dilated until they swallowed the iris, staring upward into a ceiling that had vanished into a velvet abyss of nothingness. The air in the room had become a stagnant, viscous fluid, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that seemed to emanate from the very marrow of his own spine, a silent frequency of dread that heralded the arrival of the final hour. He felt the arrival before he heard it, a sudden displacement of the air as if a great, lightless vacuum had materialized directly at the head of his bed. Then came the touch, the sensation of 10 distinct points of freezing, localized pressure settling around the circumference of his throat with the delicacy of a master jeweler. These were not the fingers of a living man, they possessed the texture of ancient, parchment-dry leather stretched over petrified wood, long and impossibly thin like the gnarled branches of an oak that had never seen the sun. The grip was neither a caress nor a stranglehold, but an anchoring, a declaration of ownership that sent a wave of crystalline frost through his carotid arteries and into the depths of his panicked brain. In the suffocating silence of the room, a new sound began to emerge, a rhythmic and labored expansion of lungs that had long ago forgotten the warmth of a living breath. It was a wet, rattling inhalation that sounded like wind whistling through the ribs of a shipwreck, followed by a long, sibilant exhalation that carried the unmistakable, cloying scent of a deep earth grave. The proximity was intimate, the invisible entity leaning so close that Elias could feel the cold draft of those non-existent lungs puffing against the crown of his head, smelling of wet wool, iron-rich decay, and the bitter alkaline of ancient dust. Every instinct screamed for him to thrash, to howl, to claw at the air, but his nervous system had been hijacked by a superior, malevolent will that kept him pinned to the sheets like a butterfly in a display case. From the distant, hollow reaches of the ground floor, a single, sharp sound cut through the atmospheric pressure, the crystalline, silver chime of a hand bell. It was a thin, lonely sound that vibrated through the floorboards and the walls, a summons that seemed to ripple through the very fabric of Elias's reality. As the echoes of the bell faded, the iron-like grip around his throat intensified, not to choke the life from him, but to act as a tether, a guiding force that exerted a sudden, irresistible upward pull. His torso was hauled into a sitting position with a violent, jarring motion that caused the iron bedframe to shriek in protest, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the stagnant chamber. The movement of his body was no longer his own, he was merely a passenger in a vessel of flesh that had been conscripted for a grotesque purpose. His legs swung over the edge of the bed with a mechanical, uncoordinated grace, his bare feet meeting the floor with a dull thud that felt distant and disconnected from his senses. As he was forced to stand, he heard the internal symphony of his own anatomy, the dry, staccato pop of his knees, the grinding click of his vertebrae, and the wet snap of his ankles as they bore the weight of a body they no longer served. He was a marionette carved from living tissue, his strings held by the long, knotty fingers that remained locked around the nape of his neck, guiding his every step with a cold and terrifying precision. The walk toward the hallway was a slow, agonizing descent into the heart of the nightmare, each step a testament to the absolute loss of his autonomy. He watched from behind the veil of his own eyes as his shadow, cast by an unseen source of light, stretched and distorted against the peeling wallpaper, looking less like a man and more like a broken, multi-jointed doll. The air in the hallway was even colder than the room, a subterranean chill that smelled of stagnant basement water and the sharp, medicinal tang of the widow's liniment. As he reached the top of the stairs, the darkness below appeared as a black, swirling whirlpool, and he felt the invisible hand at his neck nudge him forward, forcing his feet to find the first step in the lightless void. The descent of the staircase was marked by the rhythmic, agonizing protest of the ancient timber, each board emitting a high-pitched, splintering groan as if the house itself were weeping for what was about to occur. Elias felt the coldness of the oak banister against his palm, his hand sliding along the wood with a slick, greasy friction that made his skin crawl with 1,000 invisible insects. With every downward step, the sound of his own breathing became louder, a frantic, shallow wheezing that contrasted sharply with the slow, wet, and deliberate rasp of the entity that walked directly behind him, its chest pressing against his back like a wall of wet, unyielding stone. As they reached the ground floor, a faint, sickly luminescence began to bleed from the dining room, a light that possessed no warmth and offered no comfort. It was a pale, matted green glow, the color of stagnant pond water or the foxfire that blooms on rotting logs in the deep woods. Elias was steered through the parlor, past the empty rocking chair that continued to sway with a slow, hypnotic creak, and into the dining chamber where the air was thick with the scent of a feast that had gone catastrophically wrong. The heavy oak table sat like a sacrificial altar in the center of the room, its dark, polished surface reflecting the flickering, emerald light of a single, tapering candle that sat in a tarnished brass holder. The candle did not burn with a natural flame, it was a sputtering, silent orb of green fire that cast long, dancing shadows of the furniture against the walls, shadows that seemed to possess a life and hunger of their own. At the head of the table, Adeline Gable stood waiting, her frame shrouded in a tattered, black silk gown that appeared to absorb the light around it. Her face was a mask of ecstatic, reverent devotion, her milky eyes gleaming with a frantic inner light as they fixed upon the space just above Elias's shoulder. She held a long, silver-handled utensil in her hand, her fingers twitching with a rhythmic, anticipatory energy that made the metal hum with a low, crystalline vibration. Elias was forced into the chair at the center of the table, his limbs being folded into place with a sickeningly smooth efficiency that suggested this ritual had been performed countless times before. Before him sat a single plate, larger than any he had seen in the house, a massive, shallow basin of white bone china that appeared to have been polished until it glowed like a fallen moon. It was empty, a vast and sterile expanse of porcelain that seemed to hunger for whatever was to be placed upon it. He could feel the vibration of the table beneath his hands, a deep, rhythmic thrumming that matched the heavy, wet heartbeat of the house itself. Mrs. Gable leaned over him, the scent of her skin a mixture of lavender and the sour, metallic odor of old blood. She reached out with a hand that felt like a bundle of dry, freezing twigs and stroked his cheek with a tenderness that was more terrifying than any violence. Her touch left a trail of numbing cold across his skin, and as she leaned closer to his ear, her voice emerged as a sibilant, liquid hiss, a series of wet consonants that required no words to convey their meaning. She spoke of the transition, of the necessity of the fresh, and of the honor of being chosen to sate a hunger that had survived the grave. The grip on his neck suddenly shifted, the long fingers spreading out across his shoulders and pressing downward with a force that surpassed the strength of any living thing. Elias felt the air leave his lungs in a single, silent gasp as his torso was forced forward, his chest meeting the cold, unyielding surface of the large porcelain plate. His face was pressed against the center of the dish, the smell of the ceramic a sharp, mineral tang that filled his nostrils and mouth. He was pinned there, a specimen laid out for a feast, and as he struggled to draw a single, agonizing breath, he felt the light in the room begin to fade, eclipsed by a massive, looming presence that rose from the empty chair at the head of the table. A shadow descended over him, a silhouette of such profound density that it seemed to be a hole in the universe itself. It was a shape of immense, towering proportions, smelling of fresh-turned earth, wet wool, and the dark, iron-rich fluid that leaks from a guttering carcass. Elias could feel the weight of this entity as it leaned over him, a crushing, gravitational pull that made his very bones ache with the pressure. The green light of the candle struggled to penetrate the gloom of the shadow, illuminating only the long, translucent fingers of the thing as they reached for the edges of the plate, their black-tipped nails scraping against the porcelain with a sound like a diamond being dragged across bone. From the darkness above, a sound began to manifest, a rhythmic, metallic friction that echoed through the hollow architecture of his skull. Vzik. 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 It was the sound of a heavy, serrated blade being drawn across a coarse sharpening stone, a deliberate and unhurried preparation that vibrated through the plate and into Elias's jaw. The sound was steady, a metronome of impending butchery that filled the silence of the dining room with a cold, mechanical promise. Each stroke of the blade was accompanied by a low, contented humming from the shadow, a sound of profound and ancient anticipation that made the very air in the room tremble with a grotesque, predatory joy. In the final moments of his consciousness, Elias heard the sound of Adeline Gable beginning to laugh, a soft, tinkling sound of genuine, grandmotherly delight that rose and fell like a nursery rhyme. It was a sound of absolute, domestic bliss, a celebration of a household ritual completed and a husband finally fed. The sharpening stopped, replaced by the wet, heavy sound of a blade being lifted and the sudden, overwhelming sensation of a freezing, invisible weight settling upon his back. Elias opened his mouth to scream, his lungs burning with the final, frantic demand for life, but the sound was swallowed by the house, leaving only the silent, wide-eyed reflection of the green flame in the white porcelain of his own grave.